I asked Stefan to join us as our office hours guest as we wrap up this year to talk about his work with his YouTube channel, which is called Build the Lanes, and I'll link to that in the chat in a moment, as well as a really powerful and provocative article that he wrote for the Strong Towns blog saying America has no transportation engineers. A powerful and necessary claim, and one that I'll ask him a little bit about as well. But Stefan, you want to introduce yourself to the members here at Strong Towns and kind of kick things off a little bit about you and how your sort of path has led you to the point that you're at now.
So thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm quite honored to be the last guest of 2024. If you guys don't know me, my name's Steffen Berr. I'm an American-educated civil engineer. I went to Sac State where I got my bachelor's degree in civil engineering. Worked for around 2 years in the private sector. Also did a few internships prior to that with the experience in the public sector and the private sector. Then in those 2 years, I kind of felt like I hit a roadblock pretty quickly in terms of learning about the science of mobility. And I kind of ended up using COVID as an opportunity to everyone started working from home. So I just moved my home abroad to the Netherlands, and then I just continued working from home. And then I've been here ever since, working now the equivalent of what I did in the US, now I do in the Netherlands. I worked as a transportation designer for the company Arcadis for around 2 years, and now I work with the city of Haarlem as the we don't really use the title traffic engineer in the Netherlands. Instead, we will call it like a traffic technician or traffic advisor. So my official role by the city of Haarlem is now traffic advisor, where I've worked a bit longer than a year, and I pretty much have to check all the transportation projects that happen within city limits to make sure that it's helping us achieve our goals. And that's about it.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of thinking. I mean, titles matter. And do we engineer traffic, or are we, technically like trying to adapt it to modify it? And I know that engineering includes that, but is there anything that you would highlight in terms of the significance of why these types of titles matter and why maybe engineering is a title that gets misapplied at times to the work that of adapting existing streetways?
Yeah, I think titles matter a lot. I think Dutch culture, just in general, is a lot more egalitarian, I think, than American culture. So when you work for a private company, even the CEO of the company will go on a first name basis. It's not really like it's quite a lot more casual, I would say, than American office culture. And I think also it's important because I've noticed that in a lot of cases, the PE often tends to be used. It's often claimed that we need a PE to protect the public. And what I've often noticed that it's more about restricting the supply of people who can work in a certain profession, particularly in the transportation sector. And it then tends to give a monopoly on who's qualified to work on something and who's not qualified to work on something. And when you don't have a requirement like that, it makes the professional community a lot more receptive to feedback because they don't have a piece of paper saying, "Hey, we know better than the whole community." Instead, it's just a unprotected word. Technically, anybody can call themselves a traffic advisor. We have plenty of people in the city who came from a non-technical background, but because I often say that transportation mobility science is a lot more like a softer science, like sociology. That kind of experience is quite welcome because they're going to think of factors that I wouldn't think of from a more technical background.
Unpack that. What are some of those factors?
Well, all kinds of things, like social factors, human behavior, what it actually takes to encourage people to behave in the way you want them to. Things like economics, how valuable is driver's time, how things like congestion pricing. There's a lot of overlap with fields like psychology, economics, enforcement. We even deal with the traffic police all the time. We have this really interesting dynamic over here where the local police refuses to enforce speed limits unless there is a design change first, because they look at us and say, well, hey, that's not our job. Like, that's a design problem. You guys go ahead and fix this first. So this is when, and then this is where we collaborate a lot more with people who are specialists in behavioral nudges and things like that.
Yeah. I because
I kind of threw a lot there at you. Sorry.
yeah, no, I appreciate it because it really traffics with a lot of the focus around at Strongtowns that came out of Chuck's own like evolution as an engineer with the ability to call himself a PE and grappling then with the question we continue to design for the people that we wish that we have rather than the people that we have. And so when someone uses the system wrongly, it's their fault and it's ascribed to some, in a sense, there was no way that we could have prevented somebody from speeding in that street because we told them that they need to go a certain speed, or we need them to make sure that they're wearing bright lights when they cross an intersection or do those various types of things. um, but I want to pitch, sort of move into the idea that we are, as an organization, we've been, Chuck's been brought before courts and others, directly challenged. There's a yearning to reform a profession and practice of what we do with our transportation sort of routes and networks. But there's also a lot of sort of built-in tension there. Do you have any thoughts on how you are seeing maybe an evolution of that? I think you've been critical, but you're also probably hopefully finding some people that are willing to like come on as allies. It's not all grim news. What does that sort of state of play look like?
Yeah, that's the question I was really trying to dive into when I was thinking about that article I ended up writing, the America has no transportation engineers. And I think that there's this in the article I talked about how there's maybe this like collective insecurity in the profession because
Mm,
there's maybe some at some level some awareness that they have a crippling reliance on bureaucracy and standards, and they don't often have an answer for people when they ask, well, why? Well, why? And if your whole income and your whole education relies on that, it can make, I think, many people very defensive. And what I try to do in the article, I don't know how successfully I did, was that I was not trying to call many professionals uneducated or stupid or anything like that. What I was trying to do was say, hey, we're missing an entire class of professionals here. And I think like where we could really reform is I'm not sure how many people in the chat might be familiar with the terminology, but when you have an engineering plan, there's usually what we call like certain percentage stages. So for instance, there's the 95% stage, there's the 100% stage, the 60% stage, and it kind of shows like how detailed the engineering plan is. So 0% is basically a blank piece of paper, and 100% is a document that can be handed to a contractor to be built. And where I really think there's a really good chance for opportunity is the first 0 to 30%, because the 0 to 30%, that's the part that gets determined by completely arbitrary standards, where civil engineers will just kind of copy and paste whatever template that their county or city has already provided for them. And that's kind of the transportation engineering part, was where you're going from blank paper to interpreting the problem, coming up with a solution. And I think that's kind of where we need to have some reform and say, hey, we'd like to have some different specialists to work on this first before we then hand off this 30% completed plan to the civil engineers to then figure out and do all their good work on it later. So I would say it's kind of like carving out a piece of the process that's currently not even really being done well, and then
yeah.
handing that off to someone else who's a specialist in that field. And I think that in the long term, we need to have a separated college curriculum for specialists like that. But I also think that there's extra training
Yeah.
that people could take on the side in the profession
Yeah.
to learn about that, and then also passing requirements at the city, state, and federal level about mandating certain types of sustainably safe design that they do in countries like the Netherlands.
Hmm. Well, and we've been trying to support the work that Scott Brody has been doing. He's someone that's interested in changing the International Fire Code, because the International Fire Code is at odds with safe street standards, with efforts that are being made to promote walkability, to promote all of those things, because it has still baked in requirements of excessively wide road widths. And,
Yeah.
Mike Brown just jumped on, and Mike has a great visualizer on his website that actually does what Mike, you can talk about it in a moment, but what I love about it is if you try to make the lane width too wide in the visualizer of what your project will look like, a notice comes up that says this is not recommended, and in
Yeah.
fact it will degrade the street performance in terms of all users actually being impacted by it. And I think that is part of that mindset and that methodology that really needs to shift. away from the ability that we have to make sure that these are better than what we've replaced it with. Like we're making those modest sort of technical improvements as we go along. And I just linked to an article that I wrote about Selkirk, Manitoba, where they realized, hey, even as they had already poured curbs in place and people were trying to navigate the space and it wasn't quite working, so they just knocked it out and re-established the radius and made it work better. And that stood out to me as like an example. Like so often that doesn't happen, and so often it's like you said on the design stage, and then each of those phases, and then once it's locked in, it's set in stone or literally in concrete, and then it's, well, we will assess after, after we turn it back over to the public. And you're like, no, it has always been the public's through this whole process. And maybe as an element of you're trying to speak popularly to regular regular folks like myself with your YouTube channel, how is your perspective on the role of the public in the design of public spaces and transportation networks in particular? How has that shifted? And do you have any guidance that you think either stands out that Haarlem is doing, or things that you wish that maybe was happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so what's interesting is that no matter where in the world you are, like you hear kind of the same complaints and worries from people whenever you deal with public infrastructure. So, a great example is parking. Like we, in the Netherlands, have quite a reputation, but we have the exact same complaints when it comes to taking away people's parking. Like it's kind of shocking sometimes how familiar the similar the conversations are. Because I think I'm back in California sometimes when I'm working over here. I think that's something that they do really well here is that they take the public engagement very seriously. And quite often whenever we do a street redesign, so every 30 to 40 years, streets get rebuilt here. Instead of usually hosting the public town hall meeting in the city hall, what we instead do is we put the meeting on the street itself that's going to be built or in a building that's really close to it. And then we also have sent out postcards, and there's a QR code where they can look up the website that has all the information about the project. And then we have at least two of those meetings, so people can just walk 200 feet outside the front door. Then they can talk to the city engineer who's responsible for the project. And so we kind of just try to make it easy for people to be engaged. And then we had different types of involvement. So we have projects that just follow a standard process where we have our kind of city policies that kind of mandate how we redesign things, and we'll take it to a certain stage, like we call it a sketch stage, and then we take it for community feedback. So we don't just come with a completely blank slate piece of paper to say hey, what do you want? We kind of take it to a rough sketch, and then we take it to the community, and then we'll kind of go from there. But we also sometimes have a special process where we will hire a specialist designer, then they work together with a community group to then come up with the design that the community actually wants. And so long as it's not wildly against city policy, we'll usually go for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's a question here that maybe there's an interesting way to reflect on this that Greg has put in is the number of near misses versus the number of confirmed, fatalities or casualties that occur at an intersection or at a key location. Is there any way to assess that? And I feel like that's part of the narrative of transportation reform is not just the sheer number of people that have been struck and killed, but also the number of people that have been, near missed or dissuaded from walking in that particular area. I have it as a father where I'm like, am I a moron for venturing out into a space with a child that I know to be marginal at best? And should I actually, fully reconsider? And I think a lot of our passive decision making really does cause us to reconsider and sort of rule out vast swaths of our communities as being off limits. And then you get the consequence that people say, well, nobody walks here. And so do you have any suggestions on one, tracking near misses? Is there any way to work with that, or at least make that more a part of the popular discussion?
Yeah. Should I share my screen really quickly?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sorry, also my cat's meowing in the background. He's deaf, so he can meow quite loudly sometimes. Sorry about that. Let's see here. Sharing, just 1 second here. Okay, let's see if I can figure this out. Okay, so this is something I've been busy with over here is trying to translate and break down the Dutch system for people who are not from here.
Mm,
And yeah, I think that kind of comment with about the 600 near misses really kind of hits the nail on the head, because the idea is that if you're waiting for a crash to happen, you're well far behind where you're supposed to be, because you're hopelessly far behind. And that's not really how we approach risk here. We approach much more scientifically, and we try to filter out as much as we can, as possible. And the idea is we try to fix risk at the highest level possible, because if we can intervene at a higher level, we can exponentially filter out more risk than we would at a level before. So like, to kind of give you like a maybe of a more concrete example, this is like an inverted pyramid, and at the very bottom is personal actions. And that means like if somebody is on their cell phone and there's somebody on a crosswalk, and if there's a crash about to happen and the driver slams on the brakes, the first step would be, hey, well, why is this person on a cell phone? They might try to blame the pedestrian, say, hey, why didn't the pedestrian look both ways? But then you can follow this diagram. You can keep going levels up. For instance, you could say for enforcement, why wasn't there a speed camera there, right? And then the level above that is, wait, why wasn't the crosswalk better? Why was a crosswalk not painted clearly? Or the geometric safety, hey, maybe the road is way too wide here, which causes speeding. Until you get all the way up to network safety, which is, why do we have to cross 6-lane stroads whenever you want to go anywhere?
yeah.
And so when a lot of times when I consult on projects, or people from the US ask me to look at a project, they usually are looking at a problem very geometrically, where they pull up a
Mm,
street view map of a specific intersection or a
mhm,
specific road, and they say, Stefan, how do you fix this? And I say, I could give you a band-aid, but what you really need to do is go on satellite view, and you need to look at the entire route. And you have to really kind of fix it more at a network level, where you could say, hey, maybe traffic as a throughout isn't even necessary here. Maybe you can reroute it somewhere else. You can close it off to most traffic, and then you can filter out 95% of the risk that way.
mm,
Um,
mhm.
and so this is kind of a visual, I call it the risk filtration matrix, that to get engineers to think about it differently. And this whole, I think one of your questions once was, what are some examples of engineers not being well trained enough? And I think this is kind of a perfect example, which is when traffic engineers wait for crashes. But if you look at any other engineering field, like say aerospace engineering, like that would basically be criminal. Like they use the hard statistics to filter out risk as much as possible. And you
Yeah.
you never hear of aerospace engineers starting off by blaming pilot error for every
Yeah.
single airplane crash that happens. So yeah, we need a much more like scientific and statistical approach to
Yeah.
traffic safety.
Yeah. I want to bring in Mike Brown, who works. He dropped a link to streetplan.net. That's the tool that I was mentioning. Mike, what comes to mind in any questions that or discussion points that you and Stefan can go back and forth on? Put you on the spot.
Oh, well, thanks. I was just hoping to sneak in the back and listen, but no, that's fine. Um, yeah, I really like the discussion, because that's why I invested in creating this tool. Was I was looking at the fire chiefs and the traffic engineers and saying they all won't bend on 12-foot lanes. 12-foot lanes are our standard. That's our code. We have to have that. And I can't remember if it's you guys or who made a funny meme that we hurry up and rush to solve the accidents that were
Yeah.
created by hurrying up and rushing.
Hmm. Hmm.
It was funny because it had a fire truck that was speeding down the road to solve a crash from a high speed.
Mm,
One of the things that's really interesting about the discussion is traffic engineers think about speed. That's connecting A and B at the fastest speed possible. But the secondary effects is where all of this really happens, and it doesn't enter the minds of most people very quickly. So, the secondary effects I'm thinking about are induce demand and sprawl. Because when you make a high-speed strode or any kind of high-speed access, it encourages the next wave of development to go all the further away. And if we focus on how do we bring people back into the center of our cities, how do we make that nasty and decaying parking lot an attractive place to be again, so that they won't sprawl out into the hinterlands, but they'll come back and recycle this spot that we already have. That's, I think, the real key, and it's all about beautification, not just beautification, but slowing things down. And because you cannot beautify a strode and make it attractive to the market for walkable mixed use unless you make it nice. And the only way to make it nice is to make it slow. But that's kryptonite to traffic engineers. They're like, I don't know how to make this. I don't want to make this slow, even if it's safer.
Right.
Because safety for traffic engineering is always safety at high speeds. That's what they mean when they say they care about safety. They care about safety at high speed. It's not safety at low speed, because that is, they would care about safety at low speed, except that it's low speed.
Yeah.
And we hate low speed. Another angle that I've been working on, and I'll be quiet, but I've been developing this new genre of traffic engineering, I guess, that's called placemaking alternative intersections. And what that does is it makes it possible to reduce congestion at intersections and reduce delay. And then, which is what traffic engineers love, and fire chiefs are going to love it. Everybody loves that. But what you do with that is, once you successfully have reduced delay that's caused by traffic signals, you then have a lever for traffic calming. So you can take a 12-foot lane and make it 10, and you can introduce street trees, and you can do on-street parking, or a whole bunch of different treatments that will result in lower speed, safer speed, and will make the place beautiful, so that the market will recycle the parking lots and turn it into mixed-use development. And then, but you've satisfied the traffic engineers, because you didn't make it slower. In fact, you made it faster. You can lower the speed limit from 45 to 30, and still prove that everyone gets to where they're going faster, because you don't have as many red lights.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Steffen, I mean, your experience navigating, I mean, some West Coast traffic, all of that, versus like where you've got very dense populated areas in the Netherlands, although that density often falls off quite quickly once you get out into the outlying areas. How does that sort of shift the way that your encounters with sort of transportation decision making, like frameworks, and how, I guess maybe an element of it is like, what do we do? Like, what is it? It feels like to ask the International Fire Code to be changed, as Scott Brody has discovered, like, is really challenging, and he's taking efforts, and I think we can build more of a network to do like that the code just needs to be corrected, and the operating systems that sort of emerge out of it need to be sort of tweaked. But there's also a question, like at the local level, what are some of the things that you've noticed to be effective, either over the pond or on this on this side, that you think you would highlight as the path forward? And I know there's no single bullet, but what, and even draw on what are people saying about your channel and some of the work that you're trying to do with that?
I think it helps to make it crystal clear what exactly the goal is for whatever. I call it travel services, whatever travel service you're working on. Like what is the goal that you want? Because all these things we're talking about with traffic engineers, with like delays, safety, speed, all of these are assumptions. There's no formal education behind it. There's basically no such thing as a traffic engineering major in college. It's a civil engineering major that you take one class. In most cases, three if you're lucky. If your college offers several electives and they happen to be offered while you're enrolled. So it's not like you're talking to a mechanical engineer who has studied this stuff for 3 or 4 years, and it's all based off of very empirical mathematical formulas. It's all assumptions, and to kind of demonstrate what I mean by that is they use these metrics like level of service, and what is that? That's just that lumps all types of movement into a single type of category, and it just says, okay, well, this is how much time is wasted, and that's the metric they use for everything, which is really like that's really ridiculous because we haven't even established yet, well, what are we trying to do? Like, so if, in the case of a neighborhood, the best way to explain to a traffic engineer is like, look, man, you're a mobility engineer and there are many different types of mobility. So I like to explain this to people using vectors. So you could imagine kids playing on the street as like, kind of like drawing a circle out where, they're running around and there's no specific destination. They're just running around the street playing. That's a specific type of movement that you need to make safe. And that means that, hey, you need to restrict lots of high intensity fast traffic from moving there. And, both of those types of movement are important. You need to make a place safe for placemaking and for activities, but you also need efficient through roads. And this is also a reason I love strong towns, is because you guys actually, I don't know if it was on purpose or not, you guys actually completely reinvented exactly what the Dutch road system is, which is having through roads and then access streets. That's more or less exactly what the system here is. I don't know if you guys went to the Netherlands when you guys came up with that terminology, but if I were to explain
went to Disney for it. And so it was at Disney that he said, there are areas where like people, and so it was actually at the people scale level. He was like, this is the area where you can see the bypasses. And that's where like people, but also particularly staff and like some of the utility carts, they use those. But if you want to like go and gather or you want to wander, then you use it. And he was like, but actually that applies. This was back in the day when he was running his own consulting company. And it was like, actually that applies to our roads as well. So it was, and then it was finding that confirmation that, hey, actually places that have more functional transportation systems really do sort of find that dichotomy. Is this a place for building capacity, building wealth, building prosperity, building that sense of, togetherness, or is it something just to move you from one of those places to another one?
And that's why I tell people, like, look, I can make a travel surface great for flow, or I can make it great for access, but I can't make it great for both. Like that's my confession. I don't think anybody truly can. And so it lets you get well beyond these very sophomoric metrics like level of service. And you say, okay, I want this to be a good flow road. And that helps you immediately move the conversation to the biggest bottleneck in cities, which are intersections. And I say, great, I can help you make this a great flow road. We need to minimize the amount of stop and goes along this route. And then we can look at the worst bottleneck, and then we can calculate how many cars, how many bikes can get through here. And then when you know that critical bottleneck, now you know how many lanes you need. And then it becomes very easily, and the math is actually quite simple. You can very easily empirically prove to people saying, hey, this is actually how much space you need to have a great flow road. I've had conversations like this with a traffic engineer before. There was a buddy I went to college with, and we went radically different ways. And I was explaining some of this to him, and I was explaining to him how you just need a single lane, then you flare out to multiple lanes at the intersection. And he was like, what about all the traffic backing up? And I say, just how many cars can accumulate during a green cycle? And I wrote out the math for him and said, this is how wide the queuing lanes need to be. And he stared at it for like a good 30 seconds. He was like, that would actually work.
Yeah.
It was like a classically trained traffic engineer. And that's also like what I try to do with my channel, is that I actually try to make an effort not to come across just like an urbanist. I don't really consider myself an urbanist. I just try to consider myself an actually scientifically trained transportation engineer. And I think that can mesh very well with urbanism. Something I hear about in the Netherlands a lot is that the role of the transportation engineer, as the design speed of the travel surface goes down, the traffic engineer has a much less of an influential role in the project. So if there's a residential street being redeveloped, that has a pretty minor traffic function. So I kind of am in much more of an advisory role where the urban planner takes the lead, and I just say something if I see something that I think is like, hey, that's kind of unsafe. Can you maybe do this instead? But I'm very much in the background on processes like that.
That's really interesting because we see like access, an access area would be a parking lot. And oftentimes I'm struck, especially when I travel south of the border into the US, like how over-engineered the parking lots feel. And they are designed, they are like perfect travel lanes and very like elaborate sort of signaling, or not signaling, but like signage and all of these things. When you're like, this is always going to be at very slow speeds. This is also going to like conflict with, if you're in a wheelchair, you actually have to like go the long way around because of some accommodation that's made just for the movement of vehicles. And I think that the idea that you take a less of a role in that type of space is really interesting to me. That I feel like there's an element of that kind of touches on what Jonathan has asked in his question here in the chat, which is, hey, like people will ask for change only when they know that another way is possible. So how do we make people like not take their culture and their built environment for granted, but actually begin to see, like, we have a saying at Strong Towns, like once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's been at the heart of like a membership program that's like, I see it and I care about this and I want to go on and do things differently now. How do any guidance on what that looks like? Maybe using popular media the way that you are, but also trying to do so within the profession. How do we crack this nut? And actually, this is probably a question that's more broad for the whole crew as well. But maybe you start, Stefan.
Yeah, sure. I'm a really big fan of quick build projects and tactical deployments where you can you can talk about an idea where you say, hey, we want to close several of these intersections off. We want to have this more hierarchy between roads and streets, and you can actually kind of do that with cones already. I mean, we already do that with temporary traffic control, and that's kind of the method I would use to maybe convince a lot more of the naysayers to do something to take away a travel lane, and then show the engineers the data. You can't really argue with numbers, and that's something we do here also in the Netherlands and Haarlem. Whenever we're looking at a pretty contentious project where we're anticipating a lot of public backlash, before we actually do it, we will use cones and like. I can actually maybe can you guys see my screen still, or should I reshare it?
I'll reshare it.
Okay. So we have this. Can everybody's? Oh wait, no. Wrong one.
Oh, that's what your banking info is.
Oh, sorry, wrong one.
You're good.
There we go. The Google Maps. Is it going through?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That looks great.
Yeah. So we had this intersection right in front of the train station, which is a bit strange when you think about it. We have the train station in Haarlem, and we have this busy regional road right to the north of it, which is not actually great land use. But the idea is that we want to rebuild this intersection, and we want to have more room for cyclists and more room for pedestrians. And that means that we want to close off this right turn lane here. So you can no longer turn right. And we also wanted to close this left turn lane here. Mm-hmm. And there's other intersections close by where people could still end up where they needed to go. And so we just did that with cones, and we tampered with the signaling just to study the effects of it, and also to see how people would react to it. And we did a 6-week study, and the data more or less kind of supported the conclusion that this will not really hinder traffic that much. It's going to give us a lot of extra space back, and now we have an actual like scientific study to justify our decision off of. And we do all that before we've spent any money on putting any concrete down and things like that. That's how I would do it.
Yeah. I'm gonna share in the chat a story from Dave in Philadelphia, who, because what you said, checks out so many ways, and I would love to see more departments that actually just began to operationalize this. He noticed that there was an intersection that was really unsafe, and especially for cyclists, people would swing wide when they made the turn. So he just used City of Philadelphia cones and just like narrowed the lane a little bit right at that intersection. And when it came to time to restripe it and I believe even repave it, the work crews were like, oh, these cones must have been put here by, an all-knowing authority. And so they reoriented the new geometry matched what he had just done on his own. And it sort of like came out belatedly. And maybe this is one of the elements that we are quick to like champion, like, I'm live streaming the fact that I'm putting these cones where they previously weren't. Like, actually, you've got it, it's sort of, if you've got a secret, it's hard to keep it. But in some of these instances, there can be a ton of value of that cone just appeared and probably some all-knowing entity has put it there. And the consequence is there's a temporary modification of the street, and then it gives you an opportunity to adapt to it. And I think that we make temporary modifications of our streets all the time. If a car breaks down, that's a temporary modification of the street. If we decide that we want to enable construction, we modify the street in order to make that work. And I'm always like, if we can enable construction of large projects by allowing the street to be closed for 3 weeks in order to pour the foundations, what if we said, let's enable traffic, people to move through this space with a little bit more dignity? And so I'm going to throw a technical question at you that was submitted by Michael Bevins, who asked, he had an idea. Stephen believes that it is all done, so he is heading out. Oh, the funny things that AI understands in the chat. But sorry, I got distracted. So he suggests if you want to reform a strode, you're going to either slow it down to make it a street or barricade it off to make it a road. That's, but he says, what about a third option? And I don't have a firm opinion on this, but I would be interested in your thoughts. He says you could always do sort of a fast lane and then a clear barricade, so that way there's not sort of a blurring of the lines. And then the slow lane is to the right, where, say, if you had 2 lanes, 3-lane each way strode, that 2 of the lanes would have sort of the travel barrier right in between, separating them from the 3rd lane. And that 3rd lane is deliberately constrained, constricted, and resembles a little bit of what you've described and Jason has described in Not Just Bikes videos on like the Dutch having sort of parallel roads that are streets running alongside the arteries that are passing through. And then he says the left lane is the one that gets the priority treatment. There's fewer intersections, and then you basically open it up. Does that resemble a concept that is currently in the wild, or is that a novel way of looking at it? It's a trial by fire. Imagine this is your transportation engineering final exam.
Okay, putting me on the spot there, but
Yeah.
I'll do my best. I'm gonna share my screen again.
Perfect.
I think this actually might be I was hearing what you were saying. I think maybe this might resemble a little bit about what he's talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this isn't with barricades. This is after a redesign. But I think this kind of simulates that, where the travel surface immediately adjacent to the development is an access street.
Yeah.
And the Netherlands, we call it an ETW. Maybe at strong towns, you guys call it a street. And then this over here, this is your road. It actually has a bus lane in the middle. You can't really see from here. And it's multiple lanes in each direction. It's the main travel corridor between Haarlem and Amsterdam. So I mean, as a temporary measure, I definitely think you could do something with that, because there's just so much work to be done. There are so many stroads in the US that you're not going to be able to build everything from scratch immediately. I do think, though, that eventually the most important things to fix are going to be the number of intersections and the number of driveways, because you can always think about the conflict point between cars and cyclists when they're along the road. But what's just as important, if not more important, are the perpendicular conflicts. So every time your bike path intersects with a driveway or an intersection, that is a extremely potent conflict point that also needs to be addressed. And I think that you're going to also have to eventually make network changes and network tweaks, where you're just limiting how many intersections there are in general. And you can also do that with barricades, where you just completely close off a leg of an intersection, or you might make it just one way, and then you have a much safer system. But yeah, you're still using barricades and cones and things like that. And then you can do that until it's time to rebuild the street. Then you can actually have a better dichotomy between streets and roads. Yeah. There's a great there was a great TikToker called Mr. Barricade. I don't know if you guys know him or not, but he made some great content, and he did similar things to this, where he specialized in traffic control and he would use cones, he'd use barricades, and he would make very safe Dutch style intersections at a fraction of the cost of capital improvement projects.
Yeah, because you think of all, the just upfront ante for another signal, another sort of, bank of, lights, all of those things like the scale of the cost just increases so rapidly. And I think this is an interesting question that we had with a discussion with the Federal Highway Administration. They were like, "Hey, we're really interested. There's a lot of content on like downgrading a strode environment and making it more street-like. But do you have anything that's like strode to road, like enabling it to actually perform that function that you need it to have and function in?" So let's open it up. Any sort of questions, rebuttals, complaints, objections to either lodge with Steffen or commentary that you want to offer as well? Some great thoughts here in the chat as well. But yeah, thank you, Danny, for dropping in Mr. Barricade as well. I think I've watched his stuff. It's good stuff as well. But
I haven't been able to read all the comments in the chat yet. Sorry, but I'll see if I can catch up.
And actually, maybe Danny, you were just sharing, Danny Wynn, just prior to this, that you had been helping the local transportation commission to go out and do site visits at places where fatalities had occurred, where people had been struck and killed by cars or by people driving those cars. Do you have any thoughts on what you've heard so far? Because I know that safety for everyone in your community is front of mind for you.
Yeah. I don't have questions directly. That I did have one that was burning in the back of my mind though, because you went to Sacramento State. I'm also in California, in Northern California. Hi. And I was wondering, obviously, regrets are kind of a weird thing, but what I was hearing from you is kind of validating that like you don't need a civil engineering degree to like know how to like understand this stuff. So in the United States, it might be hard to like get classes for like just a specific traffic engineering like whole degree, but would you like look into other majors or areas of study if you like went back to school, if you could do it again sort of thing?
That's a good question. If would I do a different degree? That's a good question. One thing I did like about my civil engineering degree, and I'm surprised that other people don't come to the same conclusion, is that we study things like geotechnical engineering, structural engineering, environmental engineering, and all those are very formula and science heavy. And then you take this transportation class, and so much is just based off of assumptions and not science. That's one reason I kind of got drawn to it, because all the others, to me, all the other subjects seem so boring by comparison, because it felt like we had those figured out and we didn't have transportation figured out. So in a way, I don't necessarily say I would regret my study, because I think it's ultimately what led me to like really wanting to. I don't even necessarily know what to call myself. I sometimes like to call myself like a road scientist or something like that, but that doesn't really like hit. So I still think about it, about what I would call myself sometimes. I think I sometimes like do some interesting work with systems engineers, which is like a very like complicated technical degree. I've heard a lot of great it's interesting. Some of them kind of come up to like some similar conclusions that I have, even though they have never set foot into a single transportation class. Also, then urban planning. There's a lot of overlap between good urban planning and good transportation engineering. And I actually would have liked to have learned a bit more about good urban planning, human factors, and also architecture, because something that makes a big impact on people's driving behavior is the architecture of the street and also the surrounding buildings. And
That's helpful. Yeah, that's really helpful, because Chuck recently had a podcast about like talking about, I think it was even one of his own daughters, and like just don't close any doors, look at all these sort of opportunities. And I've sort of been looking into this area of like how do I like take the best steps towards my education, which Strong Towns has obviously helped with, like the transportation stuff that they talk about and the academy courses. Because what I'm finding is that when I'm in the room with these people who are paid staff members, with the best intentions, they're, working on like zombie projects, like highway expansions that we can't afford, we'll never be able to afford. And now they're like turning to me like, oh, this person knows what they're talking about and is like putting pressure on us to like grapple with like the severity of the problem and the backlog of infrastructure maintenance, yada yada yada. But that's very helpful because I have a background that is more holistic, more social science, which also
Yeah, there was a guy over here in the Netherlands who came up with what we call the untangling concept between the through roads and access streets, and that guy didn't even have a technical background in traffic engineering. It was a completely non-technical field. So yeah, I would definitely say that use that as encouragement. And I also like I ran into strong towns very early. Back I think when I was like still in high school, and I had been to Germany multiple times. And my brother and I often complained about how something kind of just felt wrong with the public space in the US. We lived in this little town called Auburn, but we were 17, 18 back then. We didn't have any way to describe it. And then I remember reading some of Chuck's articles. I was like, yeah, that really describes it. That like hits the nail on the head for me.
Wait,
That's
Auburn?
kind of what
You're from
opened
Auburn?
my eyes to all of this.
Sorry, you're from Auburn, California?
Yeah, I'm from Auburn.
Okay, yeah, I'm familiar. Yeah, that's a sprawling neighborhood.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll call on Patty Steinschneider if you're available and still active, because your work as a community development expert and really working on a ton of different projects. I'd love to hear your reflections as well, Patty, if you're available. There we go.
Yeah.
Jump in.
So what's your actual question?
What are you thinking about, and what are we getting wrong? What do we have to get right? I know you think in big pictures, so I always appreciate that.
Yeah, it's probably what gets me in so much trouble. I mean,
I know how you feel.
Yeah, something I've been dealing with, which I don't know how much of it I've discussed that anybody is aware of. The Tappan Zee Bridge was replaced. Now it's the Mario Cuomo Bridge in New York, and they came to us and said, not actually does, but to Sustainable Westchester that I'm involved in. They came and said, would you guys be willing to try and figure out how, now that we've put a bike lane and pedestrian lane onto the bridge, how that's going to work when it arrives on Route 9, that kind of is our connector road, our state road that connects all the villages. We obviously gamed it 5 different ways to Sunday. And while we obviously had to address the idea that this is people getting on and off the bridge, we looked at 5 communities from Sleepy Hollow to Tarrytown to Irvington, Dobbs Ferry, and Hastings, 5 villages that all share Route 9. And we talked about that the impact of bike riders and people coming off the bridge as pedestrians could be felt that far away. Somebody coming over the bridge, deciding to ride down to Hastings for lunch. So what we were able to do is do a consortium of the 5 villages. We hired Nelson Nygaard to come in. They were terrific, helping us with the idea of not traffic, but street design. And, we kind of backed into the reality that the state all of a sudden realized we're redesigning their road.
Yeah.
We're basically, and there was a lot of, well, you don't really have to do that because our experts already know. It's like, I put myself kind of in the crosshairs a couple of times with, I avoided saying it, which was, what we're trying to do is fix it. Trying to have the people who broke it fix it doesn't really work. So we've been working, this has been going on now for over 5 years. And we've gotten it down to where we're talking about real changes from a strode to making it a street. And we're talking about real changes in terms of all modalities of transportation. So we're really looking at different options up to and including one of the bike companies that provides, the bikes that you can just get on and ride, they've come to the villages and they're willing to do that in our villages on the concept that we're going to improve cycling well enough that people would be more inclined to get one of these bikes and maybe even, ride at a distance. I don't know how they're going to control getting their bikes back if you're starting to cross the Hudson River. But maybe it's good for up to the end and back, and you can't like keep riding into Upper New York State. But it's been a real experience dealing with people. The community, obviously, initially we had a lot of reaction from people who assumed that this meant we we're going to lose parking spaces because we were going to create bike lanes, and there is some of that that's real and it's happening. But we've kind of gotten past that. We then had a meeting because now what's happened is it's shifted from Nelson Nygaard to now it's in the hands of the New York State DOT. But they're aware that they have to be working with all these communities. So we've had a couple of meetings that were open meetings, and I was overwhelmed with like 250 people showing up from the communities, not to complain, but to really engage with, we want to make sure that we get this crosswalk installed. We want to make sure that we're getting lights at the crosswalks. The level of intelligence that they have been bringing to the conversation has been remarkable. So it's actually given me some encouragement in these days when I find there's an awful lot to be discouraged about and not really sure what's going to happen next. And I've kind of started noticing how many people from CNU are buying homes in France. Andreas started it, but now there's a whole bunch of people who, it's like, is it time to get out? Although I wouldn't move to France because I can't speak French. I guess I don't speak Danish either, but I'd be willing to move to, to Copenhagen.
Yeah.
So cool. I mean, that's something I've been working on, which is kind of parallel to some of the stuff you're talking about. It's just really the big problem we find is that there's this thing called a traffic engineer. And the people who really identify themselves as traffic engineers all seem to be stuck at that stage Chuck was at when he first got in, before he realized that there was a error being made. So it's like these are the people probably who complain about somebody like Chuck and say he has to be punished for criticizing our assumptions about what the future can be.
Well, and having the temerity to suggest that an alternative might actually work much more effectively, kind of like what you said, hey, we ended up just by continuously saying we have standards for what a street environment needs to be like to benefit all people. It bleeds into the space that is, presumably carved out. Oh, that's for the thoroughfare. And it's like, no, that is actually part of a neighborhood. And that's going to be a critical part of that. And
absolutely.
Yeah, that's really awesome. We're almost at our time. I'm going to throw it over to Steffen. Any closing words, arouse us and inspire us all to take the next step? What does that look like? And any closing thoughts?
I would say I have a lot of faith left for positive change to happen. Basically because we can't afford not to, because we can't afford the infrastructure we already have. So I kind of see a positive outcome is inevitable. It's just a matter of like how long we're willing to suffer before we get there. Positive words. I think actually, there's a city in the Netherlands called Rotterdam. And it's actually very similar to the US because it has a lot wider roads and because it was rebuilt after the Second World War. And what's actually interesting about North America is that it's actually easier to do a lot of these projects because you guys have such an abundance of space. Whereas, where I work, we have very constrained right of ways quite often. We have to sometimes come up with really ingenious, sometimes impractical solutions. Working on the other side of the pond, you have a whole world of possibilities. So it has its drawbacks, but also has a lot of opportunities. I just wanted to let everyone here know if you guys ever have any projects that you guys need help with, or you guys are interested in getting some feedback on, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to take a look at it. And let's try to make some improvements together.
Outstanding. Great. Well, I hope for all those that joined today, I'm so grateful that you've taken the time out of your day to have this discussion, to participate in this. And I also, yeah, like I said at the outset, I hope you have a great holiday season, that your life is filled with the warmth and joy of others in your lives, being with you and celebrating together. And then we will pick up again with members' office hours on the 10th of January. So I believe, if my dates are correct, I have a problem with dates, but whatever the first or the second Friday in February is, January. And we'll continue. It'll be in the same time slot. And over time, we'll also bring in Chuck is we're trying to get him scheduled to be able to do this once a month, Edward Erford, and then also I guess like Steffen and others to have the time together. So thank you so much, everybody. Hope you're having a great rest of the day, and take care, and all the best. Thank you so much, Steffen.
Thank you. Have a good
Enjoy
one.
the holidays, guys.
Yeah, you too. Take care.